Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. Thanks for joining us. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm an e-learning evangelist with eLearning Brothers. Today we're going to be talking about 6 tips to create an effective e-learning experience. This webinar will be recorded and you'll get a copy of it after the webinar. We'll send it out in an email. Today we have Jen Fairbanks, a senior instructional designer with eLearning Brothers with us today. Thank you for joining us, Jen. We're really glad to have you with us. If you guys have questions during the webinar, we'll be ready to answer your questions in the questions panel, or during the webinar, I'll try to bring those questions up to Jen. So feel free to use that questions panel as you need it. We'll get to as many of these as we can, but if we can't get to your question, we will do our best to continue the conversation in the webinar recap. Just so you know, one of the things we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just to get feedback. Most of the time we would like to touch base and find out if anyone needs some one-on-one clarification about our webinar topics after the fact. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Jen.
Great, thanks Andrew. So as we start today, I want you to think about the first story you remember hearing or reading as a child. What was the name of that story? What was it? At a very high level, what was the story about, maybe in just a sentence? And how do you feel when you think about that story? What kind of emotions does it bring up for you? Go ahead and put those in the chat panel.
So these are stories like, I'll go ahead and share one of mine, Peter and the Wolf. That was a story where a little boy from Russia goes out and hunts a wolf. He ends up catching it with a rope. Some other answers coming in here. There's Good Night Moon.
Oh, that's a good one.
The Sneetches on the Beaches. That's a good one.
Good.
Scared. I Love You This Much. Dumbo. Ricky Tikki Timbo. Charlotte's Web. A Spider That Saves a Pig. Alice in Wonderland. Go Dog Go. I had that book. Monster. There's a monster at the end of this book, which was Grover from Sesame Street. Captain Kitty, Little Boy Blue, Brothers Grimm, Winnie the Pooh, Clifford's Dog, Cat in the Hat, Grandpa Bunny Bunny. I haven't heard of that one. How My Parents Met and Had Our Family, created by my mom. That's a great one.
Oh, I love that one. That's my favorite.
A Penny for Whiffles, more Winnie the Pooh, Wizard of Oz, Hansel and Gretel, Aesop Fables, like The Lion and the Mouse, Huckleberry Finn, Cinderella, Green Eggs and Ham. Wow, 2 green eggs and ham in a row. Where the Wild Things Are, The Velveteen Rabbit. That was a big one for me as a kid,
that's a good one.
The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Lyle the Crocodile. Genesis, the Creation from the Bible. Where the Wild Things Are, Little Engine That Could. Dr. Dolittle, that's just some of them.
Okay, lots of great answers there. So the reason why I ask you about that, and I ask why to think about those stories, and chances are, as you think about those stories, you probably have a warm fuzzy feeling. Maybe you have a smile on your face. Just recall, it allows you to recall those memories, because even though you heard those stories or read those stories a very long time ago, even as you're a grown adult, they still have an impact. They still have an impact on you, whether it taught you a lesson, whether it was, in the case of the person whose mother wrote about how their family got started. They're all ways of connecting with you, even though you're a lot older, or you're older now. They create a connection for us, and that's what stories do. So with stories, since the beginning of time, stories have been used to teach, share, and inform the masses of people. For example, this image that's on the screen, it's a cave painting, and it's probably teaching something along the lines of the cultural norms or the ways of sharing within the community. There's some animals on there. There's groups of people. So even back to the time of when there were cave people living, stories have been used to help to inform people about the world around them. So there are actually a lot of reasons why stories work well for learning, but we're going to focus on 3 primary ones today, and the ones that I like to think about as the reason why I like to incorporate stories in the courses that we build here for eLearning Brothers. The first one is that we're hardwired to actually connect a story with our own experiences. When we're sitting listening to a story, we're looking for ways to internalize it and connect it with our own experience. It engages our brain with prior learning. So when we're able to connect a new story or new information that's something that we have already learned, it helps to create that stickiness and additional points for that information to connect in the brain, and it helps to file away and store that information so that we're able to retrieve it later. And when the brain creates that stickiness through that story, chances are we're going to be able to, once it's been filed away, we're going to be able to retrieve it later, because not only do we have that new information that is connecting in our brains, that old information that it connects to is another point to help bring that story out, or that new information out when we need it later. Okay, the second reason is stories help us find the relevance in the content that's being presented. With adult learners especially, adults want to know what's in it for them, what they should care about, or why they should care about that new information. And stories help us find that relevance. I can remember sitting in a stats class in college, and I was just having the hardest time learning the information. And one of the things that my professor did for me is related to information that I already knew about. I'm an avid sports junkie. I love basketball in particular, and the way that he used some of the examples, he related it and used analogies in telling the stories and relaying that information. And as soon as he started doing that, telling stories about basketball teams and how stats and things like that mattered, that's what helped to make it click. So when we're able to use those stories, it allows us and helps us to find that relevant information, and allows us to see that bigger picture, and to get the gist. That's it allows us to get the gist of the bigger picture of what that new content is. Okay, and then third is that, and probably my favorite reason why stories work, is stories just have the ability to take us to another place. I mean, if you think about your day-to-day activities, things that you're involved in, you've got emails stacking up in your inbox, you've got deadlines that are quickly approaching, you've got your kids screaming for whatever it might be, their shoe is lost, or dinner needs to be made, you've got to make a stop at the grocery store. The nice thing about stories is that stories take us to that other place, and it allows our brains to stop thinking about all of those other tasks that are weighing down our day-to-day activities, and it allows us to clear our minds and clear our brains about and actually think about that new information that's being brought in, and it's a great time for the brain to actually learn something is when the mind is free and clear, and when those stories kind of take over, and it's just a great way to learn when the brain is in that free feeling state, and it allows for great learning to happen. So when you're able to successfully create meaningful connections with your learners, and through stories, you're able to catch their attention, and you're able to change boring content into an appealing narrative. If you think about some of the types of content that you're tasked with creating courses for, whether it's compliance training, HR-related training, policy training, when you take that and you put it into a narrative and you put characters and a story behind it, it makes it a lot more appealing and engaging for your learner. And it's what allows to actually drive engagement, retention, and ultimately the big reason why you're doing it is to drive that behavior change, the key purpose and the reason for that training. So today we're going to look at storytelling and e-learning and discuss a few tips and share some stories and some ideas on how to create an effective e-learning experience and help take your design to the next level. The nice thing is that a lot of these principles you're probably already using, especially when you think about your days in grade school and high school and college. You did a lot of these things as you wrote papers and things like that. We're just going to help refresh your memory of some of these things and help help you to use that story arc to your advantage. We're also going to show you some examples of what, as well as to how we've applied this within some of our courses at eLearning Brothers, and hopefully give you some ideas and jog your thought processes of ways that you can incorporate these ideas into your own courses. Before we move on, any questions to this point on any that we've covered?
No questions at this time.
Great. So let's jump into the meat of this. So we've all heard in real estate, location, location, location. Well, when it comes to storytelling, it's structure, structure, structure. So regardless of whether the story is meant to be a best-selling novel, a cinematic thriller, or the most amazing, visually engaging, awesome e-learning course that's ever been constructed and known to the face of mankind, the story of the structure is all built the same way. So let's take a look at that structure. The first thing is going to be a character. The characters are going to be the lifeblood of your story. They're what draw people in. They're what gets your learners to care about the information, to care about the material. It helps to add credibility to the tale. Especially with your characters, they need to ring true to your audience. So for example, if you are creating a course, a safety training course for workers in an auto plant, you would probably want your story to have characters that are in that setting, in an auto plant, on the line, working on those vehicles. You wouldn't necessarily want the characters to be office workers. While you can do it, it's not going to be as effective. You want the roles to be based on individuals that are in the situations of your audience. And it's also what helps to make your audience care. When we talked earlier, when I asked you about the stories from your childhood, you probably can vividly remember the characters. You had an emotional connection with them, you cared about them. And the same thing is true with e-learning. You want the characters to be vulnerable, to have a story to help get the message across. And when I say characters, it doesn't even, going back one step, it doesn't necessarily have to be a single character. It can be multiple characters, especially if you're doing story-based scenarios. A lot of times situations will involve multiple people. So that's one way to do that. Set your character up to help tell that story. The second thing, so once you've got a character for your story, a problem occurs. So that's the second step. The problems should be based on the real-life situations at the heart of the issue. So, for example, if we go back to the example of the auto plant, let's say you're teaching a safety course, and one of the things that you're teaching in that course is about fire hazard safety. You want to make sure that those scenarios and those stories are based on real-life types of situations. And the way that you do that is to get to have those conversations with your SMEs and asking them about the specific things that are going on in the day-to-day activities of the workplace that are causing the problem. The way that you would start that conversation would be something along the lines of, tell me about a time when, or tell me about what happened when there were too many plugs plugged into the outlet and the electrical fire started. That gives you the basis of what your problem is, and that helps you to get the data points to write your story. It's also all in the details. You want to make sure that the steps that you include in your problem, or the things that happen within the situation, are specific to whatever is in that story. So if there's specific terminology, wording, verbiage that the people in your office use or within your business use, make sure that you're using those same terms, and that you're getting all of the details of that process or that situation, so that you can make sure that that problem rings true and that the learners can identify with it. And then as you're having those interviews with the SMEs, You also want to make sure that you are asking about the common misunderstandings for the errors that cause the issue or the problem in the first place. And the reason why that's important is that as you're writing your story, and if you're including scenarios within your situation, that's where the feedback is going to come from to help you write that feedback to actually elicit that behavior change. Maybe there's something that the workers are doing. Maybe they think it's okay to plug, all 6 outlets in, or, utilize all 6 outlets, when in reality it's only safe to plug in 4. Whatever those common misunderstandings are, those are going to be at the root of the feedback that you're going to use, and then it also is going to be at the root of the questions that you're going to ask to actually drill down and to solve the root cause of whatever that problem is. Okay, step 3 is going to be a series of relatable events to follow. This is going to be what shows the cause and effect of what the problem was, what happened, why did it happen. In the case of the safety course, what caused the outlet to blow? Why did it happen? Well, Joe plugged in too many plugs into the outlet. So, why did that happen? That allows you to help learners identify some of the causes of the problem and ultimately make different choices later on. It also helps you to create that clear connection between actions and consequences. So you would ask questions along the lines of, were proper protocols followed? Was the fire as a result of equipment error? Was it human error? Was it something that was avoidable? Could it have been prevented? Things like that. Step 4 would be a lesson is learned. So this is where you ask your learners the what if type questions. What if I would have made a different decision? What would the outcome have been otherwise? And this is going to be where the behavior change happens. So you're showing them, especially if you're doing scenarios, allow them to see what the impact of their decision was. So if it's the auto fire, the safety fire, and there was a problem in the warehouse that caused a fire, what was the ultimate end result? Because they chose to plug in 6 outlets instead of 4, it caused a loss of money to the company. They were, unable to work in the plant for a couple of weeks while they fixed the fire damage. Allow them to feel that impact of their decision and actually allow them to learn that lesson in order to help facilitate that behavior change. And step 4 is really where you're going to be able to drive home those affective objectives that you don't necessarily hear about, or I should say drive towards performance. You've got your performance objectives and things that the learners need to do at the end of the course, but it's rarely talked about that you're able to hit home on those affective objectives. What do you want the learners to feel at the end of the course? And step 4, where the lesson is learned, is how you actually drive home some of those affective objectives. Okay, and then step 5 is kind of the moral of the story. The story concludes. This is where you reinforce the key messages, the all's well that ends well. The learners have the opportunity to maybe make decisions and choose a different outcome. And the nice thing is that by the time you get to the story concluding, the characters kind of having their wrap up, it allows them to think differently and have that action step of, okay, what would I do differently in the future? I know what caused the problem. I know what the correct answer is. What are the steps that I need to take in order to prevent this issue in the future? And it obviously doesn't have to be something about workplace safety. It could be HR issues. It could be a software training issue. Whatever that behavior is that you need the learner to think about and have that take action on. You want to make sure that as they're leaving that course that you drive home whatever that key message is for the course. So I want you to take a look. This is an example of a compliance course that we built, and I want you to look at it, and within the chat I want you to call out things that you notice right away. Does this look like your typical compliance course that you're used to? What do you notice that's different?
I'll go ahead and come in and read you their responses. One person says it looks more like a video game setup. Another person says there's lots of possibilities. It looks engaging. There's a time countdown, a time limit. It draws you in. One person says that they want to take this compliance training. That's how much it draws them in. There's a story framework for a mission. It appears to be a game. It clearly states the mission. Very little text. Someone's excited about that. There's choice and a timer. It's your mission. It's personalized. You feel like you are to accept this. Let's see. It looks much more visual than a typical game or compliance training. Engaging colors. It looks like the user's imagination is required in order for this to move forward and be really successful. Someone asked if there's audio in this compliance training.
That's a great question. There is audio in this compliance training. Okay.
One person says they're upset they didn't think of it first.
Yeah. So lots of great answers, and the ones that stuck out to me from what you guys have just said is my favorite one is they would be excited to take this training. The ones where you guys say that you would be excited to take this training. This is compliance training, right? But because we've put a story around it, we put the learner in a role. The setup for this particular compliance course is that the learner has to save the world stock markets by gathering the right information, putting clues together. If they take the right action, then they'll save the world's economy, and if not, then the hackers will be successful. They'll get through, and the world economy and the financial markets of the world will collapse. Based on the choices that the learner makes, this is a branching-based course. Based on the choices that the learner makes, will determine their end result of whether they're successful or they fail. But along the way, they're presented with information related to compliance and the things that they need to do in order to be successful within their day-to-day roles in the real world. The nice thing is that if they do fail and the hackers are successful, they have the opportunity to take the training again and make those real-life decisions in that safe environment of the training course, rather than having to face those decisions and make those choices in the real world when security really is at stake. So the other thing that I haven't specifically called out within the deck as far as why stories work, but you called it out within the chat, is that stories are visual. They create that imagination, that excitement. When you log in and you see this, you're excited and you want to take that course because of the visual way that the course is engaging. So that's another key when you're telling the stories, is just make it visually appealing. Okay, any questions with those first 5 steps as far as the story arc? You've got your character, you give them a problem, the series of events, they learn their lesson, and then it concludes. Any questions on that as far as how to build that in?
There's lots of questions about what software this was built in.
That is a great question. This was built in Captivate, I believe.
Okay. That's one big question. There was a question we got earlier that I didn't, it goes back a little bit. They want to know about characters. There were a lot of comments about the character on the screen, how he has a lot of facial movement. It looks like his facial features will drag you in.
Yep.
And earlier, someone asked, is using characters that appeal to imagination effective? Do you want to have creative characters, or will a sort of two-dimensional character or one-dimensional character still work?
That's a great question. So, and we'll touch on some of these questions a little bit later in the course. So if I don't answer them once we get to those sections, definitely we can revisit it. But one of the things that we do within our stories, it doesn't necessarily, with this particular example, it is a video that the learner sees and engages with and watches. But it doesn't have to be a video. We've got an extensive cutout character library at eLearning Brothers, and we actually utilize those to help tell the stories. It can be one-dimensional, two-dimensional. It's the story. It's the what's happening to that character. What are the problems that are going on? When you're able to create that empathy for that character, and I don't want to call it pity, but when you're able to allow the learner to connect in ways that might ring true for them. So, for example, if you were to create a course about something that the learner might be struggling with, and the character in the course is also struggling with that same thing, they're going to want to tune in because they want to see how the character gets through it and tackles those tough issues because they're struggling with that same thing. So that's not to say that videos aren't great. Videos are absolutely great. They're engaging, but the heart of getting the learners to care about the course and the content and what's going on with it is the way that you tell your story.
Okay. Another question about characters. When do you do that character development?
So the character development normally, that's a great question. So the character development happens after we've already identified the objectives of the course, after we know whatever the task is that the learner needs to know, do, or feel at the end of the course. And then from that we kind of work backwards to say, okay, what's appropriate for this situation? We want to make sure that it's appropriate for the company that we're creating it for. Certain companies might be a little bit more formal and they wouldn't like cartoon-based animation. That's not necessarily their style. They might prefer something more cutout character. And then there are some companies that do want that animation. So it really just depends. But the characters definitely are established very early on. And depending on how much the character is used in the course, I would probably run it by our stakeholders before ever putting it into the storyboard, just to make sure that they're on board with the vision and the ideas. And that's one thing that I haven't talked about within the deck, but I'll mention it briefly. Anytime that you do a story or a theme-based course, for example, with this compliance course, you want to make sure that you've got the buy-in from your stakeholders and that they're on board with whatever story that you're going to present to your learners. If it's a more formal company, they may not want, and I just alluded to this, they may not want cartoon-based characters. They may want something more professional, and that's not to say that cartoon characters can't be professional, but just make sure that as you create your stories and as you craft your stories, that you're matching the tone of your organization. And we'll get into some of that a little bit more.
Awesome. We have a few more questions. Do we have time to take a few more questions?
Let's go ahead and keep moving, because I think I may be able to answer some of these questions as we go in further. Okay. So the tip number 2 is begin with the end in mind. Question, and this is kind of more of a rhetorical question, but I want you to think about when the movie Titanic came out, and I don't even know how many years ago it's been now. But if you saw it either in the theater or you watched it when it came out on DVD or Netflix, when you entered the theater or you watched it at home, how many people were surprised by the way that it ended? Was anybody surprised? And chances are it's probably no one, right? We we knew how the Titanic ended, and it still became one of the biggest blockbuster selling ticket movies of all time. And it's not because people wanted to see how the ship sank. They wanted to see that story from the time that they left the dock until the ship ultimately sank, and then some of the characters and their stories after it sank. People were invested in those characters, and they wanted to see what that story and what that journey would be. And the reason I bring that up and the Titanic up is the end of whatever that end goal for your course is, whatever you want your learners to know, do, or feel by the time the course is over, that whatever those objectives are, that's gonna help you determine and set your story. So you've already got that predetermined destination. If you know that your learners need to be competent with a particular piece of software, or they need to be able to recite a policy backwards and forwards and know all the intricate details, you already know that when you start designing your course. So once you have those goals and those objectives of what needs to be accomplished, that allows you to work backwards. Okay, and then when you start with the end in mind, and this is a pretty big thing when you're writing your stories, is when you start with the end in mind, it ensures that your narrative fits with whatever that bigger picture is. So if you go in and I'll be the first to admit, when I first started writing stories, it was a little bit rough. I'd get the story idea first, and then I wanted to morph the content to whatever that story was. And as I've started to use stories more and more, it's easier to know what that end journey is, whatever that end destination is, and then make sure that you're creating your narrative based on whatever those bigger picture goals are. One way that you can also think about it as you're creating that bigger picture narrative is if when my learners are done with this course, if they walk away and they know nothing else from this course, I need them to learn X, Y, and Z. That's going to be the focus of whatever your story is, and you're going to create situations and characters and plots based on whatever those bigger picture goals are. Okay, so this is an example of a course that we created for unconscious bias. We knew that within the bigger picture, the overarching goal of this course, we wanted learners to be self-aware of their own biases. And so we thought to ourselves, how can we simulate that within a real-life work environment? How can we make it ring true for our learners? And just to kind of pause and step back, one of the things that you'll notice about this story compared to that spy-based novel or that spy-based story, detective story that we showed in that first example of the compliance course, is that stories, they don't have to be about fantasy situations and James Bond and all of that made-up stuff in order to be effective. Stories can be about real people, day-to-day interactions and activities, and still be effective. So with this particular course, like I mentioned, it's about unconscious bias, and we wanted the learners bigger picture. Once they walked away, if they take nothing away from this course, we want the learner to be able to be cognizant of the way that they're interacting with others in their daily lives, and just small things that they could potentially do and behavior changes and things that they could make in order to make an impact and be more aware of their unconscious biases so that they could, you know, make a more positive workplace for those around them. So within this particular scenario, we simulated a conference call for a group, and it's a global group that this conference call takes place. And this is one of those situations we talked earlier about whether it needs to be 3D or 2D or 1D. This particular example was actually created using still photography, office images in the background, and then our eLearning Brothers cutout characters from our library. So that's where we got the sourcing for this. And then as the learners, quote unquote, talked during their conversation during the conference call, the characters changed their poses to simulate the actual movement that one might see on a conference call. So as they go through this experience and they are shown these characters, or they're kind of a fly on the wall of these of this conference call, we ask them specific questions. So we ask them, you know, is this an example of you know, positive bias, negative bias, or a neutral statement? And as we ask them to make that decision, they're provided feedback. If it's correct and they accurately identify what type of bias it is, we show the engagement of the team going up. The reason behind that being is that even though they may not be the direct target of whatever that bias is, the engagement of the team as a whole goes down when unconscious bias isn't correctly addressed. So we've got the meter on there to help reinforce that. And then once they've identified whether or not the type of bias is occurring, we ask them to take a next step within the activity and say, okay, we know that this is an example of bias. What should the character have done instead? And then we allow them to make some choices that they could potentially use. And this is where it gets the learner to actually think about, oh, okay, if I was in this situation in real life, if it were me, what should I say instead? Or what should I do instead? And it might be a situation in some of these examples, it's a situation of, actually, I probably, you know, I shouldn't say anything additional, or I don't need to say anything, you know, based on the comment. It's, you know, I don't need to make further comment on it, or it allows them to identify what the correct way is to actually handle that situation. And then again, the meter goes up and down depending on the learner's response. Okay, Andrew, questions on beginning with the end in mind? Anything in that section as far as how to do that?
No questions on how to begin with the end in mind, but okay, along this vein, some questions from earlier kind of hit here.
Okay.
When planning this out, what kind of timeline do you need to create to create compelling story-based training modules? If you're doing this story, how much time does it add to the rest of your project?
That's a great question. So it depends on how in-depth the story is and how in-depth the feedback is and the types of feedback that you're going to be offering, and whether or not there's branching involved. If it's a simple story where you're just talking about Joe Schmo and you're talking about the events and things like that happened to him, it's really not much longer than just writing a narrative script. Obviously, you want to maybe plan a little bit of buffer time in order to make sure that the narrative sounds correct and bigger picture, it makes sense and it flows. But it doesn't really take a whole lot of additional effort to write a basic script as it does to create a normal narrative for an e-learning course. But the more branching that you include, the more decision points that you include, the twists and turns, just like it would be with if you were writing any other kind of a story, the more in-depth and detailed you make it, the longer it's going to take. So for example, with this particular interaction, there were probably 7 different scenarios within this particular activity, and it probably took a day to write the 7 scenarios, just with all of the feedback and the iterations to it. And then it also involved back and forth with the client to make sure that we were saying things correctly, and you know, getting that feedback from them and getting it incorporated. So all told, the 7 scenarios in this particular activity were probably a day and a half. But it just kind of depends, like I said, on how detailed you want to make that feedback, and what you want to include. And as you're first starting, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail later, but as you're first starting writing your scripts, it will take a little bit longer, just if it's new and it's not necessarily something that you do very often. But as you do it more often, just like when you learn anything, right? When you do it more often and you become comfortable with it, you're familiar with it, you get into kind of a groove, especially once you hit that groove, once you're within a particular story. The ideas will kind of come feverishly, and it will just flow and it will go smoothly.
Excellent. There's several other questions here, and I'm trying to figure out how to I mean, they're all along the same story here.
Okay.
If you have a story that's paralleling your compliance training or whatever you're designing, how do you keep that story brief and succinct and make sure that you wrap up that story as well as your training? How do you make sure that you don't lose the story in the training and lose the training in the story?
Yeah. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but one way that you do that is to actually weave the story through all parts of the course. So it might be, for example, you might introduce the story to the learner right as they come into the course. So maybe you put present a scenario or a situation where, instead of going through the traditional objective screen and getting, navigating and things like that, the first thing that the learner sees when they launch the course is that story, and they're immediately immersed. And then as you go through the course, you again pull in the stories and the scenarios at different times. So maybe later on you have that same character facing a challenge or a situation, and then as they complete an activity around that information, maybe you are giving them access to information that needs to be covered in the course. So either a resource or something like that, where they can still see the information and get the information across to them, but it's more them pulling the information rather than having it being pushed to them, so that they can go through and get what they need, but it still ties into the story. Let's, because it sounds like, let's keep going, and I think we'll address that more within this next one. So tip number 3 is to write a realistic script. The best success stories often begin with failure. I want everyone to think about this and tell me if you think it's true, if so, why, or if it's not true, why. What do you guys think?
All right, the responses are coming in here.
Great.
One person says, true. Everyone loves an underdog.
Mm-hmm.
It's necessary for the story arc. True, it's more memorable. That's how we learn the most important lessons. Without failure, there is no learning.
That's a good
comment here. Learning happens when we fail. People learn from their mistakes, hopefully.
Great.
Yeah, they're all along that line. It's true. It's the best way to learn.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. So the reason I asked about success stories being the start of failure is that when you start with something that's real, that's relatable to the audience of the story, they're more likely to engage with it. Somebody mentioned that everybody likes an underdog. Yeah, everybody does like an underdog. It makes them human. It makes them real and relatable.
Another comment here is that seeing your character fail often creates empathy for that character.
Yep, absolutely. And you want it to be a heroic tale, right? You want to see if they can turn it around and go from, you know, whatever that failure was to being successful. So whatever that situation is, or whatever that failure is, it helps you to come up with the problem for setting the stage of your story, whatever that failure is, especially if you introduce it at the beginning of your course, either through a scenario or some kind of a video or animation. It allows you to set the stage for the triumphant comeback and the lesson learned at the end. When you are creating your script, a realistic script and something that rings true for your learners is what absolutely drives your course. If the learner, and this is actually true in movies as well, if you go to a movie and the plot line doesn't match up, or there are just components where you think that it just isn't anywhere near possible what they're portraying on screen, it makes it really hard to connect with the rest of the movie and the rest of the story. So you want to make sure that as you're building and designing your script, that it's realistic for your learner. So the first way that you do that is through authentic dialogue, and that can be accomplished when you are interviewing your SMEs. And this comes in that third part of the step number 3 in that story arc that we were talking about. Make sure that the narrative is based on those real-life examples that you get from your SME interviews. What is the process? What are the details? What is the terminology that people use on a day-to-day basis, day in and day out, that is going to make this actually feel real for the learners, so that even though they are watching a video animation of characters on the screen or cutouts or whatever that is, 2D, 3D, whatever, it makes it more real for the learner because you're speaking to them in terminology that they already understand and they already relate to. And instead of fighting that, is this real, or identifying if it's, you know, instead of identifying the holes in the story, the learner is connecting with the information and actually learning something. The second thing is the proper tone. Make sure that the tone that you're using in your story matches that of the organization. And we already talked about organizational tone earlier, but it's also critical when you're creating your script. If the tone of your organization is more conversational and casual, if the tone of your script is more formal and using terms such as "it is" instead of a contraction, it's going to turn your audience off. They may not know why, but it's not going to ring true for them. So whatever that tone of your organization is, make sure that you're matching it. In most cases, if you have to choose between conversational and formal, learners are going to be more opt for that conversational tone. So if your organization doesn't really have a difference or a preference, I should say, conversational is generally better, because that's, especially in scenario-based situations, that's how people interact and how they talk with each other. Okay, and then number 3 is genuine emotion. Make sure the narrative of your story delivers that emotional impact to help achieve those affective objectives. If you have crafted a script and the situation calls for the learner, or excuse me, calls for the character to be super angry, but when you write your script notes and your narration, you're not including any of that, it might be the way that narrative voice interprets it might be very different than the way that you've interpreted it in your head, and you're going to get something very different. The same thing is also true for your learners when they're seeing the story. If they don't see the emotion on the character's face, if they don't hear it in the character's voice, you may ultimately miss on conveying that emotion and creating that emotional connection in order to drive those affective objectives. Okay, one way that we have done this in our courses is, and this is, we just talked about this as far as ways to carry out the story throughout your course. With this particular example, it's a customer service training course teaching agents how to use a software scheduling system, but it's also teaching learners how to have empathy for the customer and connect with them. So when the learner initially logs into the course, what they see is up on that upper left part of the screen, it comes in, breaking news out of California, a large earthquake just happened, and they've got all these people that are gathered in, watching the TV to see what's going to happen, and then the learner realizes, okay, I've got this earthquake has just happened, I've got to get these passengers home to their families, what am I going to do? And that's where the learner steps in and is like, we put the learner in a role, and it's like, okay, it's your time to shine. You've got to get these customers home, you've got to make sure that their mood stays good, that they like us as a company, you need to show empathy and go. So one of the ways that we do that with this particular course and showing that empathy and that emotion is that as the learner makes choices, the character's mood will go up or down, and the tone of that character will also change. So if it's a correct decision, the sound of the audio when the course plays is the character's happy. He's like, okay, great, I'm so relieved you've been able to help me. If it's maybe an okay choice but not the best choice, it's more ho-hum. Okay, well, I guess we could do that, but I'm not really sure that's the right thing for me. And then if they just choose the flat-out wrong answer, the customer's mood is grumpy and angry, just like it would be in real life, right? If you are on the phone with a customer and you tell them something that they're not happy with and they don't agree with, they're going to let you know about it. And so we made sure that when we did the audio voiceovers for this particular course, that was conveyed in the narration as well, to help create that connection, because when we put the learner in this type of role, it allows them, again, to fail in that safe environment, so that when they actually get back into their day-to-day activities of assisting customers, they don't have to have the real customer yell at them, because they've already had the character customer yell at them. So hopefully they won't make those poor choices in the future. Questions on the creating a realistic script? Does that answer the questions as far as how to incorporate that through the story?
There's a few questions in that regard. One person wants to know about humor. Now, Adam Cannon had talked about humor in his storytelling webinar that you guys can look up on eLearningBrothers.com's blog. He talked about it being a little bit dangerous and safer to avoid. Do you have an opinion on that, Jen?
Humor. I tend to agree with Adam. As far as, I wouldn't say avoid it altogether. I would say the best advice is know your organization and know your customer. Humor is an amazing tool to help drive points home and to help create humanity for the character in your course. But if your organization is very buttoned up and professional and formal, that's probably not going to fly. So just gauge your audience, and the one thing, especially if you haven't done stories and themes in your courses before and you're just starting out, as you build, as you start off, you may not have a lot of trust, and your stakeholders may be a little bit more timid in order to give you that rope to do what you want to do. But as you go and you create effective courses that your learners love, one of my favorite things is when we create a compliance course or something that's a required training, and our stakeholders and our clients come back and say that people are taking it because they want to, not because they have to. That's music to my ears. But you have to start slow and build up to that if you don't have that carte blanche at the beginning. Just make sure that the stakeholders are on board, and as you do good work and as you evolve your storytelling and writing over time, that freedom will evolve with that.
Continuing on that, how do you determine that tone of the organization? What's the best way to get the pulse of the tone of the organization?
That's a great question. One of the ways that I find out, or I do that, is just through my interactions with the SMEs and my stakeholders. I will specifically ask them, and sometimes you can tell just based on the organization. But if you're unsure, or if you're not sure what the tone of your organization is, just ask. Especially early on in the beginning, before you start crafting your story, your training department will generally have a good sense for whatever that tone is. And if you do decide that you want to push the bounds and go out of the box a little bit, just make sure that your stakeholders are on board, and just make sure your stakeholders are on board. Make sure you do a blueprint and get your ideas, or an executive summary, I guess, and get your ideas in front of the stakeholders ahead of time if you're not sure that the tone and the direction that you're going is the direction that they want. Because at the end of the day, your stakeholders are the ones that give the yay or nay as to whether or not your course goes online.
Another question, do you suggest using the same character throughout the training course to maintain the story arc?
You definitely want to make sure that the course has continuity, right? So if you decide for whatever reason that, Jimmy only needs to be in the first section of the course, then as you phase Jimmy out of the course, phase him out and make sure that the learner has some kind of a conclusion. It's kind of like if you're watching an arc on TV and it's a to be continued type thing, don't leave your learners in a to be continued type thing, right? Make sure that the learner knows how Jimmy's situation wraps up. Don't leave them hanging. Tie up all your loose ends. You definitely don't have to use the same character throughout, but if you don't, just make sure that there's some kind of conclusion for the learners.
Another question, and we're out of the regular time. If you have time to take more questions, and maybe we'll take more questions later.
Okay.
But I think we can take more questions after the hour. But I do want to allow Jen to be able to finish her presentation. So I'll grab these questions later.
Okay. So we are at, oh yep, we are at time. Okay. So a couple things really quick, and I know that this was one that came up earlier as far as how to make sure that the story is woven through. For tip number 4, over, under, in, and out, that's what narrative writing is all about. Couple of quick things. Just weave your story through the beginning, middle, and end. Tighten up the loose areas. Make sure that there's not any holes within your content. Make sure that everything is covered. Nothing slips through for the learners to be thinking about why didn't they close this gap or something's missing here. For your complex scenarios, just make sure that you read through them, do your due diligence, get other people to read them to make sure that everything is secure, and then allow for adjustments along the way. Chances are your first draft of your story, and I know that this is definitely true for me, the first draft of the story is never the best. It comes over time, and as adjustments are being made along the way with feedback from my peers, my manager, our stakeholders, so definitely don't get tied to that first one. These examples will be in the deck that we're going to post, so I won't spend a ton of time with those. Incorporating interactivity. The reality is the more interactive you make your courses, the more engaged your learners are going to be, and there's a higher likelihood that your content is going to be successful. So engage them. Just like with Bloom's taxonomy, the higher you go in the levels, the greater chance for learning to occur. Again, this is some examples. And then just tip number 6, keep it short and simple to prevent cognitive overload. Just make sure that, if you are creating the most amazing interactive story-based e-learning course that the world has ever seen. Think of your learners and them sitting alone at their computer. Minimize the distractions, signpost, and recap to make sure that you don't lose them. Have a clear purpose when you are creating your story and a bigger picture game plan, so that even at the 30,000-foot view, when you're looking down, you can quickly see things that are going on, so that if something goes haywire or you have to change something out or add something in, you can easily see where that fits. And then lastly, it's a balancing act between being succinct and just covering the content and creating a cinematic masterpiece. You've got to find that balance, and ultimately, if you're having to decide between bells and whistles and things just for the sake of being in there, maybe go with a little bit being more succinct and think of your learners. Okay, and that's it.
Great, thank you, Jen. This has been great. Before we jump back into a few more questions, for those of you that would like to have your questions answered, I do want to point out that you can always schedule a demo to find out more about eLearning Brothers Custom. That's where Jen is working. That's where she's getting all of her experience, and they're constantly creating amazing products, amazing courses. And at that phone number and email address on the screen, you can contact them, and they'll show you some of these courses and give you an idea of what's possible with eLearning Brothers Custom. So, Jen, since you've got a little more time,
sure.
Let's go ahead and answer just a few more questions along some of these topics. Some of these questions are really, really good, and I just didn't want to leave them,
absolutely,
hanging. One person says, should your story, going back to defining bias, should the story provide resources to define bias before asking for opinions, or would the opinions want to come first?
That's a great question. So I definitely think, and with this particular course, we made the resources accessible. We provided them a little bit of information up front to help them understand what biases were, so that they knew the difference between positive bias and negative bias, and just the impact that both are harmful. And then after that, that's when we emerged them into the simulation of asking them to make those choices. Another way that you could do it is to make the information available at that same time, and then they could click on the resource, and if they aren't quite sure how to answer the question, they click on the resource, they read some information, and then they can make a decision. That's a great way to help scaffold for your learners, maybe especially if this is a compliance type of training that they have to take annually. If they already know the information, and they've already seen it before, or they're just, for whatever reason, they have exposure to that in their previous roles, not forcing them to go through that information if they are already aware of it allows for a better learner experience. So definitely make if you're not going to present the information up front, it needs to be made available, so that for those learners that are a little bit more novice and aren't as familiar with it, they have access and still an equal chance of successfully getting through the simulation and the scenario and learning what they're supposed to learn.
Excellent. Here's a question about eLearning Brothers Custom. Is there a demo SCORM version that can be viewed of the mission?
That is a great question. The mission, I'm assuming the mission meaning that first compliance course.
That's right.
I know that we have it housed on our servers. We'll have to check. I know that we have it housed. I don't know how readily accessible it is for sharing out with the community.
Call in and see.
Yeah,
maybe they'll have one.
Yeah. Call in for the demo, and we can show that one for you. Yeah.
One last question. We've gone a bit over time here. One last question is: most compliance training has a completion requirement for testing. Does this include that even if the slides are not visited? So if in that first compliance training that you demonstrated, is it, if they skip over slides and things like that, is there a way to ensure that you're meeting that completion requirement?
Yeah. So that's another great question. So it depends on what the overall goal is. If the overall goal is to make sure that the learners know the information so that they can pass the quiz at the end of the course, then it doesn't necessarily need to be locked down. But if for legal reasons, or if it makes the stakeholders more comfortable, you can always lock it down and make sure that they complete every section and every clickable item. It just in general, it's a better experience to have a course not locked down. It allows the learner a little bit more autonomy to get through it. So that goes back to your objectives. Is your goal to have them visit every single thing on the slide, or is it to get them to pass the assessment? And to be able to know, do, or feel certain things. And chances are it's the latter, or it's getting them through that course and to pass the assessment.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jen, again for coming to this webinar and for giving us such great information. That's all the questions that we'll take now. Be looking for an email in the next 2 or 3 hours. It'll include, I think, Jen, we're going to make this available, the slide deck available for you guys to download. And,
absolutely.
And we'll get that out in that email as well. Thank you for attending, and if you want to see more, go ahead and schedule a demo. Give us a call, send us an email, and we'll take care of you. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.